Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest Detroit Regional Chamber Tele-Town Hall series. We're glad you're with us and hope everyone is staying home, staying healthy, and is being able to get outside and enjoy a little bit of the sunshine between the snowflakes. So welcome, everyone. So for the last decade, Doug Rothwell has served as the CEO of Business Leaders for Michigan, the state's business CEO roundtable, with a board comprised of the leaders of Michigan's largest corporate employers, as well as our largest universities. BLM was instrumental in driving state policy this last decade, including making substantial strides in righting Michigan's ship of state during the Snyder administration. And with a decade of accomplishment at BLM, plus all of his other work, formerly chairing Detroit Renaissance, formerly chairing the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, working for governors in 2 states, he has announced his retirement at the end of the year. So Doug, I don't know if you've picked the world's best time or the world's worst time to retire, but the state owes you a lot and we're going to miss you terribly, but we're really glad we have you for the rest of the year during this crisis.
Sandy, I'm retiring a year too late, first of all. And I wanted to say to you before we get started, Cal, it has been a terrific experience working with you. The Chamber made a terrific hire a few years ago when they brought you on board, and you've been a huge supporter and a huge addition for the state of Michigan, and I'm going to miss working with you.
Well, you're very kind. This is the Mutual Admiration Society. Thanks for all the leadership you've provided us, and we've just in fact, we're working on something together right now. Which we're really excited about, which we'll be able to announce next week. So, Doug, let's get started, and let's start with the big picture. You are talking to the CEOs of Michigan's largest employers on a regular basis. Tell me, is there unanimity amongst the state's largest employers regarding Michigan's approach to this COVID crisis?
You know, I think what they're certainly behind and united behind, Sandy, is the need to really make sure that public health is put #1 and to make sure that their employees and their customers are protected through all of this and that they're safe. Some, I think, would like to get started back to work sooner than others. Some, I think, have gotten very used to this new work environment that we're in and have found that working at home works better than they expected it would. But I think those that have had global experience particularly are very reticent to get back too fast because they've seen what has happened overseas, and they've seen the need for kind of a detailed playbook and for there to be very clear standards set before we do that. But no question, I mean, we're all at a point right now where I think we're all getting a little itchy, and some would like to get back to work faster.
Doug, can you say a little bit more about some of the global experiences your CEOs have had in terms of what has worked and what hasn't worked?
Yeah, I think that what we've seen is that detailed playbooks are really needed. And of course, we've gone into this crisis without having any. We had to develop them from scratch, essentially. We did look back at other, experiences where we've had natural disasters and all in the past, but those are not quite analogous to what we're going through right now. And so I think the best practices have been you've got to develop a detailed playbook that is specific to your type of industry or sector of the economy. And what we've also found from overseas, what we've heard from our business leaders are that it was helpful to have government actually embrace those standards so that the people, the customers and the employees would have some comfort that it wasn't just the company saying that these were the right things to do, but and in fact were kind of validated or gotten a certification from a third party.
So we all work in a political environment, your organization, the Detroit Regional Chamber. How does the politics of the crisis differ from one region of the state to another?
Well, I think it's based on the incident rate, right? I mean, I think that if you're in the UP or up north where there's not as many cases and they're not experiencing the negative impact of it as much, it doesn't feel as real as it does in Detroit or in Southeast Michigan, where, we got one of the hardest hit areas in the country. But I'd say the other part of it is we don't know what we don't know. This fact is this virus is still out there. It's apparently much more contagious than anything we've seen in a long time, and so I think that's what's creating a lot of uncertainty also in the minds of people. But there clearly are regional differences. in terms of people's feeling and attitude towards all of this. But at the same time, I think that it doesn't excuse, just doing something across the board, for the sake of just, getting back to work. We want to make sure we do this smartly.
So you mentioned that people are getting itchy. I think we all feel that. I think our houses, no matter how comfortable they were, are beginning to feel a lot smaller than they did a couple months ago. So how does this itchiness that we're seeing out in the public kind of impact the political dynamics? I mean, we just saw that barber be very defiant, refusing to close when that's talk about personal contact. There's not much more personal contact than a barber. How does this impact all the politics of what we're seeing in Lansing between the executive branch and the legislative branch?
Well, as Americans, we don't like to be told what to do, right? I mean, and we're being told a lot what to do right now, and that is against our nature to like that. But at the same time, I think that, there's a difference between expressing one's views and, anarchy. And when I see things where you've got, masses of people with guns going up to the Capitol or protesting in front of the governor's house, with, a lot of rage and that's not right. I mean, that's not stuff that we can have. We can't have where some sheriffs say we're going to enforce the law and others don't. Some prosecutors saying we're going to enforce the law, others won't. I mean, that's not what we get to do. That's not what our country is built on. And so I think we've got to just, I think it's first of all blown out of proportion. I think most Michiganians do not behave that way. We've seen high levels of compliance with the social distancing orders and the like. But unfortunately, the news gives a lot of attention to some of these, outrageous behaviors. But having said all of that, that behavior is just not right, and it's not something that we can tolerate as a society. Again, civil disobedience, protest, fine, but let's not take it too far.
Yeah, you and I were talking a little bit offline just about how our political environment these days is just completely ill-equipped for the challenge that's before us. We have an economic challenge, we have a global health challenge, and our politics are just exceptionally partisan. And it's hard to move forward in an environment like that.
Yeah, it is, and I think it just creates kind of a level of animosity where we're looking at everything through a political lens as opposed to really what the facts are, what the science requires. And we're in one of those situations right now. And even the scientists can't totally agree. And we've got to kind of accept that we're in this period of uncertainty right now. But it doesn't mean that we should be overly trying to psychoanalyze the motivations of our leaders who are trying to work us through this situation. I think we just need to all tone it down a little bit. Let's get back to, a civil conversation and understand that the better that we work through this right now, the better our economy is going to be for the long term, getting back on its feet.
Yeah, fair point. So BLM's chair is Jerry Anderson, who's also co-chairing the Michigan Economic Recovery Council, along with the Chamber's former chair, Nancy Schlichting. Can you explain the role of the MERC to our audience?
Yeah, so the group basically came together, a group of health and public health experts and business leaders, particularly those with global experience, to essentially help give the governor some advice and develop playbooks for the key sectors of the economy in terms of what it would take to get back to work, to re-engage the economy. They weren't designed to really say when those sectors were to come back to work or what the timeframes were. That's something that the governor needs to make a decision on, but it was to give her a playbook that didn't exist before for how those sectors were to re-engage.
And how is it working? It's obviously split 50-50 between healthcare leaders and business leaders. And are they working collaboratively? Is there tension between the two sides? Give us a little bit of inside view.
Well, it's I'm not at the table. It's our business leaders are the ones there, so I can't give you the day-to-day blow by blow. But I think it's very collegial is the way I would, it's been described to me. I think that, again, what I said a minute ago is true, is that you've got, on the one hand, companies that have had global experiences in places where this crisis hit sooner, and so therefore have some experience they can bring back to the table that we don't have in America or haven't had. And at the same time, you have public health experts that are to some degree dealing with this for the first time. And so there's going to be disagreements even among them in terms of what the right path is. So the idea was to try to get all of those viewpoints on the table, that is, experiences on the table, and to try to, again, integrate them to the best degree possible so that the governor wasn't hearing from 15 different points of view, but rather a consensus around what the right path would be. And I think largely that is what the Merck has done, and has done very successfully.
And I think one of the things I've heard you say in conversations that we've had on other matters is that you're not even aware of another state that has approached it quite as methodically as we have with the Merck working with the governor.
I have calls, Sandy, every week with my counterparts around the country, and many of them have basically modeled what they're trying to do in their own states against the Michigan Economic Recovery Council, because they think it really is best practice. It's because it's being driven by data and by science, as opposed to anecdotes or what we think or what we feel. And too often, I think what we're seeing in some of the other states are kind of, well, we think this is going to work, as opposed to what's the data behind it to make us really feel comfortable and confident that it's going to succeed.
Doug, on your website, at the BLM website, you have resources from the Merck, and they reside on obviously multiple sites. But talk to us a little bit about what you can find there with the guidebooks, sector by sector, that have been put together by the Merck.
Yeah, so again, I think if regardless of virtually any sector that you're in the economy, what you can do is go to the blmcovid19.com website, or go to blmbusinessleadersformichigan.com, and it'll direct you there. And what you will find is, first of all, a wealth of information to help you with just how to handle different situations with COVID-19 for your employees and your communities. But more specifically, for your specific sector, there has been a playbook that has been developed with industry leaders from, again, getting a lot of global experience to show you step by step all the things that you should do that would really represent best practice. Now, in some cases, those have been incorporated into the state of Michigan's guidelines already. For manufacturing and industry, for example, those have been incorporated. Construction has been incorporated, but there are some other sectors, as those are opened up, hopefully those will also influence what those state requirements are.
Doug, a minute ago, you referenced talking to your peers across the country, and I know that you engage with the Business Roundtable in Washington. What are you seeing across the country in terms of businesses' response to this crisis? Are they approaching it the same way you are at BLM, or are they taking different tacks?
I think it's all different tacks, Sandy. I mean, it's a very different approach depending on the state and the amount of incidents that they've had with this. So you'll find a state like, for example, Massachusetts, that's being very deliberate. They're probably behind us in terms of the pace of opening up. Then you'll have states like Texas that are, already, almost fully engaged and really trying to get things moving again. I'd say that everybody's learning from each other. Again, that's the thing about this. There's really not been a set of best practices or a playbook that you could go to and say, well, if we just stole that idea and brought it here, we could move forward. At best, we're learning from places like, China or Germany, where even there, it's not exactly a one-for-one matchup with what we need here in the States. And so I think what I've learned is that we're all learning from each other. We're all sharing ideas to the best we can. But, to think that we can, for example, point to Ohio and say, well, Ohio's doing this, we can just do that here in Michigan. Well, maybe not. It may not work exactly right.
Yeah, exactly. And, even when we learn from other nations, including China, only have a 2 or 3 or 4 month head start on us. So it's not like there's this wealth of learning that's been documented that we can just kind of say, aha, here's the playbook.
That's right. That's right. Having said that, there are things that, we can learn. And so, for example, the idea of bringing back the economy geographically to us, I think makes a lot of sense. I think there's a reason, a good expectation that we should be able to start doing that very, very soon. And that's what a lot of other states are doing as well. But again, you have to kind of modulate it for what your own circumstances are in your own state and your own community.
What about economic forecasts? Your business leaders across the state, or maybe even nationally, what are they saying about our ability to recover economically from this big hit?
I don't hear anybody saying it's going to be a V-shaped recovery. At best, it's going to be either a U or even a W-shaped recovery, where there may be some initial boost that we get when the gates are opened up here a little bit, but then if there's a second surge of the virus, we may have to pull back. It looks to me like it's going to be a couple of years before we really make up what we lost. And what we get back to is going to look a heck of a lot different, I think, than what we left with in terms of people that are probably not going to have jobs to go back to, but hopefully there'll be jobs in other places that are created to meet kind of the new norm that we're facing. But most of the people I talk to are feeling like it's going to be a U or a W-shaped recovery, probably a couple of years to get back to normal.
Speaking of recovery, right before the crisis hit, BLM released some research, a survey of your CEOs that said that, hey, in 2020, we're expecting Michigan to lag the nation in economic growth. That was obviously before COVID. What about now?
I think it's reasonable to expect that Michigan will lag coming out of this crisis that we're in, partly because of our economy, even though it's not quite as driven by manufacturing and industrial products as much as it was in the past. It still is more larger than the average state, and that typically comes back a little slower. We also were harder hit than most states. And so because of that, I think we're going to re-engage at a slightly slower pace than the average state will. So I would expect, Sandy, it's going to be a little slower for Michigan than the average state. And if you're looking at the budget impacts, and we were talking about this offline, I mean, you could be looking at a budget cut that is literally half of the discretionary budget that the state of Michigan has on an annual basis. If it's a couple $2 billion, there's only $5 billion that is truly discretionary that the state has. Now, hopefully if the feds come through with some relief, that'll mitigate that number, but it's going to be a rough year or so.
So speaking of the budget, BLM has long had the goal of making Michigan a top 10 state in terms of economic performance. How is BLM going to have to pivot their agenda to adapt to the new reality?
I don't think you change your goals. So, top 10 in our case should still be the goal, and I think for the state should still be the goal, but your tactics might have to change. So let me give you some examples. With what we just talked about, you're going to see displacement of workers probably on a, if not permanent, long-term basis from certain sectors. People that worked in restaurants and bars. We need to focus on redeploying those workers as fast as we can. We may want to scale back the amount of energy and resources we put into long-term reskilling right now, because that's not what the need is. The need is to get these folks back into the economy, and they could work, for example, in distribution centers. We're going to have probably an increased demand for just-in-time delivery. So that's one example. Another might be for the supply chains are going to be, I think, consolidated more in the U.S. That's an opportunity for us to work with a lot of our Michigan companies to figure that out, as opposed to maybe going out and just trying to bring in companies that have no tie to Michigan at all. And another one, I think, especially now with what we're all doing with Zoom and Skype and all the distance communications, is maybe this is a time for us to put a little capital into broadband as opposed to roads. This might, and it's a lot cheaper, and it might enable us to get a lot more done over the next couple of years as we're all waiting for the vaccine to be developed to help us get through this.
I was thinking about the roads thing as I was on the road the other day, one of my first times in a car in about a week, and I just felt, these bad roads, I think they're going to be with us for a while, longer than we had hoped.
Exactly.
Listen, before I turn it over to Brad Williams for questions from our audience, I'm going to put you back in your old role of the head of the MEDC under Governor Engler. So what is the MEDC going to have to do, and what challenges are they going to face as we emerge from this immediate crisis?
Well, I think I touched on it a little bit, Sandy. I mean, I think if I were in their shoes right now, I would be trying to figure out, where are there supply chain opportunities for Michigan that would allow us to even further retain and expand the business base that we have. And I think there's going to be a bunch of them. I mean, the good news is we've got a chemical, pharmaceutical, auto base in this state that would be very ripe for that kind of opportunity. And the other is, I'd say, is that the talent is going to be shifting. The talent need is going to be dramatically shifting, and we've got to make sure that we can get those folks into jobs where they're needed, most importantly. And I guess the other thing I would say longer term is what can we do to try to maybe take advantage of this as a state to reposition ourselves as an attractive place to be, because our demographics are not going to change. And so we have to make sure that we kind of position Michigan as a place, maybe a safe harbor to live and work and such going forward. But in the immediate, I'd say supply chain and redeploying workers.
Great. Doug, let me turn it over to Brad for some questions from our audience. Brad?
Thanks, Sandy, and thanks, Doug. Doug, we know that manufacturing just opened up this past week. Do you have a prediction as to when we might see a full ramp up of automotive production for our OEMs?
That's a great question. Well, it all depends on demand, right? And if the recovery is more of a U or a W shape that I talked about a little bit ago, it's hard to see that it gets back to 100%. Maybe by the end of the year, if we're really lucky. But my guess is it's probably into 2021 before we really see that. But that's just a guess. So much of it depends on, when can we really allow people to re-engage in their jobs so that they can afford to go out and buy new cars. It feels like, again, it's probably 2021.
Yeah, it would seem it's a combination between safety and demand, I would say. What do you think is the responsibility of business leaders, in particular your members, to lead the public as far as convincing the public that of the need to accept some, fairly radical changes in the way that we're going to have to live our lives between, wearing masks and social distancing and those sorts of things? And how is BLM working together as business leaders to prepare for that?
Well, first of all, let me say we're not public health experts. So what we're trying to do is to take advice from the public health experts and the experience of companies that have experienced this overseas, particularly, to try to incorporate those into the way we work. Again, the top priority for our businesses are to keep their employees and their customers safe and to share as much information with them as they can in terms of why these practices, whether it's wearing a mask or washing your hands or keeping distance or cleansing equipment on a regular basis that you work around, is so important. I think, frankly, the experience that people will have at work generally is going to be probably the least of their concern. It's going to be more when they're outside of work is when they're going to be more susceptible to maybe not having best practices to get them in trouble. So our goal is to try to make sure that first the workplace is safe, and second that the employees are educated to the degree possible for how to extend those best practices into their own personal lives.
Yeah, I know on Friday, Doug, we have the consensus revenue estimating conference coming up, and you touched on the state budget earlier. Can you explain to folks what we think the scope of the hole in the state budget is going to be and what sort of impact we think that could have? I know, BLM has been a leader, particularly on higher education funding, and that is a huge section of the state budget.
Well, so the state gets its primary revenue from sales and income taxes. And if people aren't working and they're not buying, those revenue sources go down. The projections are a little fluid right now, but it's anywhere between $1 billion to $3 billion a year this year and next year that are being projected that the state budget could be in a deficit in terms of less revenues than it projected. To put that in context, the whole general fund budget, which is the state's checking account essentially, is $10 billion, of which half of it is spoken for in ways that you really can't change an awful lot. It's either paying for prisons to be open, basic payments to folks that are in need, and the like. So you're looking at a $1 to $3 billion hole, if you will, on a $5 billion discretionary general fund budget. What that could mean is that, for example, that would wipe out all support for higher education, which means tuition goes up for everybody, for kids that want to go to school. It could mean, for example, dramatic cuts in funding for K-12 education, the foundation grant that the state provides. So it's very, very real. The only way to really mitigate it, Brad, is if the feds come through with some support, which might help make things a little better, and for us to, as fast as we can in a safe way, re-engage the economy. But it's going to be a rough couple budget years for the state, and people just need to understand that, unlike the federal government, the state cannot print money to just make the deficit go away.
But that we could. Do you think, Doug, that there are unique opportunities coming out of this that Michigan is well positioned to capitalize on economically? Is there a place where we have unique strength that we could economically be well positioned when everything's back open and ready to go?
Yeah, I really do. I mean, I think that this whole dependency that people have been talking about with relying on production and, at this point, even engineering and research that's been located overseas, and for good reason, because it was either less expensive or more efficient, or frankly tapping into expertise that was not available in the States at times. We're in good shape there because Michigan's real depth in our engineering talent base, our logistics talent base because of the auto industry being here, and our ability to manufacture goods, whether it's cars or pharmaceuticals or what have you. Those are the very things that I think America is going to be looking for as we begin to rethink those supply chains. And so not every state's going to be able to position themselves as well to be able to locate supply chains as we are. And that's an advantage for us. And I think it's a potential game changer if as much comes back on shore as I think might.
Overall, you worked, both for Governor Engler and out of state. What are some of the big lessons learned that we can take away early on in our response to the crisis? Doug, I know it's going to take a little while before we can holistically look at the crisis and take away all the lessons, but early on, what are some of the lessons you think we can take away from this?
Well, one of the things we've talked about, Brad, in the past a lot in Michigan is we've not always been as cohesive and unified as we'd like to see. States that have done well over a long period of time tend to kind of follow the same game plan year in and year out, and we've not done that. And I think that, one of the things that I would like to see us come out of this is as a more cohesive state, that this has brought us together, shown us some unique opportunities that we just talked about a minute ago, that we can really go after and be stronger as a result. And right now, I would hope that, we would put that first. I know, again, a lot of folks are itchy to get back to work or get outside, and I am too. But we got to do this smartly, and that should be, I think the main takeaway is let's not argue, let's not hurt ourselves. Let's make sure that we are as united as we can be to take advantage of whatever opportunities present themselves.
Well, the last question I have for you, Doug, before I hand it over to Sandy, I will note there's a couple comments in the question box congratulating you on your retirement and wishing you well as you go on to Chapel Hill. But also noting that the well wishes in Chapel Hill do not extend beyond college basketball. We still are cheering for Coach Izzo. I'm cheering for Coach Izzo. Some people are cheering for Coach Howard. But as you're retiring at the end of the year, what are your thoughts on BLM's role going forward for your successor? And are there any pivots that you see for your successor?
I'm sure Sandy probably feels the same way. I mean, I feel like if I've done anything that I hope is good for Michigan, it's that I've been able to help put in place two organizations, the Michigan Economic Development Corporation and Business Leaders for Michigan, that are platforms to do good things. The MEDC to help grow the economy, and BLM to bring the business community together, the business leaders together around a common agenda. And what I'd like to see is just that mainly they're used for those purposes, that they're focused on good policy, putting the state first above any self-interest of any particular sector or any particular company. That's what those vehicles were meant for. And I would hope that whoever comes in behind me would have the same outlook and encourage the same type of vision going forward. And again, I'm sure Sandy feels the same way for all the great work he's done at the Detroit Chamber.
Great. Well, thank you, Doug. I'm going to hand it back off to Sandy.
Right. Doug, as we wrap up, I've just got one last question for you, and it's regarding emerging out of economic downturns. Every time we come out of a downturn, there's a boost in automation, there's a boost in technology. That's both an opportunity but also a challenge for a lot of our citizens. How does the state approach both this opportunity and challenge?
We have got to move faster than ever before on trying to make sure that we have a highly educated and trained workforce, Sandy. It's something you and I have been talking about for a long, long time, and we're making progress, but we got to move faster. And a great example of that is that look at the number of months our kids are going to lose in learning because of this, and we're already a below average performing state in terms of student outcomes. I don't know what more of a clarion call we need, but to use this to fuel us to really get behind reforms that are going to really make sure that our education system works smarter. Why do we have 8-month, 9-month school years? With this, we ought to be able to learn 24/7, and we ought to take advantage of it. And we ought to make sure that we've got the technology, the infrastructure, and the curriculum in place to do it. So I would say that, to me, the big takeaway is let's use this as fuel to really recognize that we've got to do things faster if we're going to really enable us to not have the negative consequences of some of those changes.
And for our audience who does not know, Doug serves as co-chair for an effort called Launch Michigan, along with Paula Herbert of the Michigan Education Association and Tanya Allen of the Skillman Foundation. And I think it would be a really great idea, schedules permitting, that we bring the three of you together on this platform to talk about, what we need to do big picture wise regarding the skilling up of Michiganders. So when we have another economic crisis, we're better positioned to rocket out of it.
Well, and Sandy, you're on Launch Michigan as well, and have been a voice for that kind of outlook. So let's make sure that you're a big part of that discussion.
Great. Doug, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for all the leadership that you have demonstrated in Michigan over the course of literally 2 decades now. And I'm not going to say goodbye because obviously we're going to work together until the end of the year, but just know how much you've meant to this state.
Thank you, Sandy.
Great. Doug, have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, we will.
Take care. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you all for joining us. We'll see you soon.